The Exodusters were African Americans who migrated from states in the South to Kansas in the late 1800s. Many of the African Americans were beginning to migrate out of the South because of the incline of racial violence and widespread repression under the Black Codes, which were discriminatory laws that rendered blacks second-class citizens after Reconstruction. During this time, there were groups like the Ku Klux Klan and the White League, which were white supremacist groups. In Louisiana, blacks greatly outnumbered whites, but armed resistance was practically inconceivable. According to William Merle, the whites in Louisiana were better armed and equipped at this time than they were during the war. As evidence of the lawlessness, the Louisiana White League seized a huge cache of weapons from the arsenal in New Orleans, worth about $67,000, stolen directly from the U.S. government. The Exodusters began fleeing from the South to escape groups like the Ku Klux Klan. On top of that, at the time, a majority of the Southern white population resented black emancipation, resulting in an oppressive environment perpetuated by white society. A big character on the Exodus movement was Benjamin Singleton, more commonly known as Pat. He was an American activist, businessman, and a former slave from Tennessee who escaped to freedom in 1846. He became an abolitionist, community leader, and spokesman for African American civil rights. He returned to Tennessee during the Union occupation in 1862, but realized blacks would never be economically equal to the whites in the South. After the end of Reconstruction, Benjamin Singleton encountered many troubled African Americans and began to organize the movement of thousands of blacks from the South to Kansas. He began urging blacks to form their own independent communities in the West. The ones that listened called themselves the Exodusters because they believed the Promised Land would be proven in the West. Benjamin Singleton was a very inspirational figure to the African Americans because of what he did. Although he made each person pay him $5 to take him to go to Kansas, and he was really just seeking a fortune, he actually had a vision of a place where the colored people could be free of discrimination. Many of the African Americans heard a rumor of free transportation all the way to Kansas, but were disappointed when they realized it to be just a rumor. This turned away very few of the African Americans. Many of the Southern whites had a very patronizing attitude towards the African Americans, especially with the Exodus movement going on. The whites hated dealing with freed African Americans because they still wanted to keep them around as a cheap labor force. Many of the whites became very alarmed when they found out about the Exodus movement and instantly began pressuring their elected officials to end it. Eventually, a U.S. Senate committee met for 3 months in 1880 to investigate the cause of the Exodus. The committee constantly argued and accomplished very little. Despite all of this, African Americans kept leaving for Kansas. By March, 1,500 had passed through St. Louis headed for Kansas. Back in Mississippi and Louisiana, there were tons of African Americans trying to get to St. Louis. Many did not know what to do once they finally got there due to lack of resources. St. Louis began supplying them food and supplies to ensure their survival on their trip to Kansas. The Exodusters would wait at the Missouri River in St. Louis for steamboats that would take them up the river to Kansas. Upon their arrival, they were given temporary shelter and directions to their land. As they explored this new promised land, they found all black towns because of the large number of black immigrants from the South. Eventually, they would find their piece of land and claim it as their own. Most of the new arrivals would exchange letters with their families and friends that stayed behind in the South. The early Exodusters' hopeful letters were being read in black churches in the South. This started a rumor that Kansas was reserved primarily for African Americans, which was later deemed false, but did not stop the movement. The Exodus movement began to end by mid-1879. The act removed around 27,000 African Americans from the South, primarily from Louisiana, Mississippi, and Texas, most of which found Kansas to be the promised land that they hoped and dreamed about. Looking at the present day, life would be a lot different if it weren't for the Exodusters. They inspire those who believe that there is a better life for them, regardless of their descent. They don't have to live the way they are told. Also, the Exodusters have encouraged those who were enslaved to break free of those bonds and take up freedom. Although many of the former slaves were afraid to try anything to get out of slavery, the Exodusters showed them that it was possible, because a lot of the Exodusters were former slaves themselves. If the Exodusters had not migrated north to the Promised Land, there might still be slavery in America today due to the lack of a major inspirational act.